The impact of the coronavirus requires an extraordinary coronavirus budget of around 500 billion rand to direct resources towards fighting the pandemic. This will include the reprioritization of around 130 billion rand within our current budget. The rest of the funds will be raised from both local sources, such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and from global partners and international finance institutions. To date, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank that is, and the African Development Bank have been approached and are working with the National Treasury on various funding transactions. Some of these institutions have created financing packages that are aimed at assisting countries that are having to address the coronavirus crisis like us.
Tonight, the world joins America in prayer and worship as this ravenous virus takes control of vulnerable livelihoods and lays bare injustice, inequality, racial divisions, class distinctions, and grief pours out onto the streets of the capitals of the world. There is a demand and a writing on the wall, and it is inscribed in protest and graffiti in Paris, in Johannesburg, in New York, and in Minneapolis. A new economic and social order must emerge when humanity rises again post-COVID-19. Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. I'm Thandeka Qubulembeki, and tonight we discuss the key problems with stimulus packages across the world. Are they really a balm for the poor? Do they prevent permanent economic and social scarring? We ask what the problem is. Where and to whom did the billions go? To households or to banks? Did we prevent some bankruptcies, some job losses? Did we feed enough people? Did we wipe away the tears of deprivation?
Tans, you need to understand that a big debate has broken out in South Africa and abroad. This debate centers around what the appropriate amount of a stimulus is. In the United States, key Democrats like Nancy Pelosi argued that the trillions of dollars rolled out by President Donald Trump were not enough and that he should top it up with more. In the US, as here at home, policymakers and academic discussions and arguments were advanced in favor of and against the stimulus package. These arguments often involved what is called the output multiplier. The multiplier effect is the increase in GDP achieved by every rand of public expenditure in the stimulus. In other words, a positive multiplier means that an increase in public expenditure raises GDP. A multiplier larger than 1 means that an increase in public expenditure raises GDP more than 1 for 1, implying that the increase in public expenditure raises other components of GDP, such as household consumption. How have we done in South Africa? Did we get much bang for our buck? But let us listen to this explanatory graph and package by my producer, Prudence Makubalo.
Broad money is the total amount of money that is held by households and companies into the economy. It is made out of bank deposits, which are IOUs from commercial banks to households and companies. Although commercial banks create money through lending, they cannot do so freely without limit. Banks are limited in how much they can lend if they are to remain profitable in a competitive banking system. Prudential regulation also acts as a constraint on banks' activities in order to maintain the resilience of the financial system. And the households and companies who receive the money created by new lending may take actions that affect the stock of money. They could quickly destroy money by using it to repay their existing debt, for instance. Monetary policy acts as the ultimate limit on money creation. The bank aims to make sure the amount of money creation in the economy is consistent with low and stable inflation. In normal times, the Reserve Bank implements monetary policy by setting the interest rate on central bank reserves. This then influences a range of interest rates in the economy, including those on bank loans. Central bank balance sheet only shows base money liabilities and the corresponding assets. In practice, the central bank holds other non-money liabilities. Its non-monetary assets are mostly made up of government debt. Although government debt is actually held by the bank purchase facility, so it does not appear directly on the balance sheet. Commercial banks' balance sheets only show money, assets, and liabilities before any loans are made. Consumers represent the private sector of households and companies. Balance sheet only shows broad money assets and corresponding liabilities. If the consumer were then to repay their credit card bill in full at the end of the month, its bank would reduce the amount of deposits in the consumer's account by the value of the credit card bill, thus destroying all of the newly created. Another misconception is that the central bank determines the quantity of loans and deposits into the economy by controlling the quantity of the central bank money, which is called the multiplier approach. Prudence Makubalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
The design of stimulus packages is an exercise in social engineering as much as it is about economic policy making. Tans, you caught up with Nobel Peace Prize winner for economics, the acclaimed former chief economist of the World Bank, Professor Joseph Stiglitz of your alma mater, Columbia University in New York. He has been critical of the design and targeting used in the construction and conceptualization of the U.S. stimulus package. You began by asking him a question about inequality.
Start at the end. We'll start with the last question, where we ask you about how to bridge the inequality divide in our own society, and it's been widening with the COVID situation, and we would like to know what a future policy matrix could be, a future policy dispensation could be for our kind of situation where we are the world's most unequal society.
Well, let me begin by saying that the pandemic has exposed in every society the enormous divides, and particularly in a poor country like South Africa, or in a rich country like the United States, which hasn't recognized the right of access to health care to everybody, in which there are a lot of inequalities. I sometimes put it that this virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after particularly those who are poor, those with pre-existing conditions, and those whose work exposes them to the risk of contact with others who might be carrying it. And the death rates in the United States of those who are poor, people of color, have been so dramatically higher than those of others in our society. So it's really exposed these inequalities. Now, the hope is that with these inequalities having being so boldly exposed, there'll be a renewed commitment to do something about it. Again, in the context of the United States, that commitment is likely to take the form of greater efforts to make sure that everybody has access to health care. Obviously, the kind of health care that everybody has access to will differ from country to country. Richer countries should have, obviously, access to more health care, you might say, than poorer countries. But I've been, visit countries like Mauritius, which has recognized the right of access to health care by everybody, and actually succeeds in doing a reasonably good job of doing it at a different standard, but still a principle that everybody ought to have access is well recognized. And that's the direction one would hope a country like South Africa would be moving towards.
It's been very divisive here, Prof, because we've got a very large HIV population size. And we also have a large community with other comorbidities like tuberculosis because of the HIV link. I think we've got the largest HIV and antiretroviral program in the world. And with COVID, this has become a bit of a double blow for our country. And we're still debating whether to go the route of universal basic health insurance. So you're saying that we should go in the direction of giving universal basic access to health care?
Yes, I think very much so. As I say, that should be the principle, and how you implement it can differ from country to country. In the United States, we're going through a debate about the best way of doing it. Should be a single payer system, or what we call a public option, where those who have private insurance can keep their insurance, but those who don't can opt for a version of what is called extended Medicare. We have a public program for those over 65. And the question is, why not make access to everybody? If they choose. If they don't choose, you wouldn't force them. So anyway, we have two different visions, very hotly debated. But to me, that's of a second order importance relative to the commitment of the right of access to health care for everybody. And that should be the focus of the discussion, and then go from there, proceed to, given the circumstances of South Africa, what is the best way of doing it? Should it be local health community centers, or whatever the best way? And it may be, given the big differences between what can be done in the urban areas and what can be done in the rural areas, it may have to be actually several different programs, but all centered around the fundamental commitment of the right to access to health care. Let me add one more thing, that we recognize today that health, which affects, as you say, all the comorbidities, is affected not just by access to health care, but by nutrition,
yes,
by a whole variety of behaviors. And so very important in my mind is making sure everybody has access to good nutrition.
Yes, and we have had long lines of people who are hungry, queuing for food in South Africa. It's been a huge humanitarian disaster on the food front. In some cities, like in the Western Cape, small towns around Cape Town, we actually saw small food riots. The government has been providing some food relief, about 350,000 food parcels from the state directly, and more from NGOs and humanitarian organizations, but it's clearly not enough. There are 14 million people here who are food insecure. What can be done in your view?
I think this is a humanitarian crisis. What began as a disease has morphed into a humanitarian crisis, partly because in many countries, the United States included, there isn't an adequate system of social protection. Even in the United States, the numbers of people who are food insecure are numbers well in excess of 15% of our population. And there were numbers like that even before the pandemic. So I think this should not be a matter that relies on voluntary contributions. I think it's fantastic that people voluntarily have stepped forward. But in a 21st century economy, 21st century society, this should be part of the basic social contract that we are rich enough, even South Africa is rich enough, to ensure that everybody has a basic level of nutrition. So I think the answer is that one has to gear up for more public provision. Now, over the medium term, the government can get more actively involved in helping create more farms that can produce the food. A lot of these people want jobs. One of the areas of jobs where you don't have people in close contact with each other and spreading diseases is agriculture. You can have agricultural production, which is relatively safe. And the irony of a world and a country where there is work that needs to be done producing food and building infrastructure, and people who want to work, and somehow the system isn't connecting the two. To me, that's very disturbing and a real symptom of the failure of the economic system.
Tans and dear viewer, the size of the stimulus package is important because it can affect how many people go to bed hungry because they have no job, and how many people are able to find gainful employment in a post-COVID economy. A well-designed stimulus package would use the unemployment multiplier, which is the percentage point decrease in unemployment caused by increased public expenditure. In other words, have jobs and livelihoods that were on the line been saved by our stimulus package? Have the measures to support big and small businesses prevented drastic declines in GDP and massive bankruptcies? Have fewer companies declared force majeure due to the stimulus? Have we plugged the leakages in the economic bucket due to COVID?
The 2020 forecast for South Africa's economic growth at -7% would be the worst since democracy, and is likely to come with massive job losses and firms closing down. There are, however, options to mitigate the economic impact of the disease. This development dialogue will start with a review of the latest trends in the pandemic and the economy, and then consider at scale responses to the economic downturn.
A package, a stimulus package, we should think firstly, what is it aiming to achieve? The first goal in any sort of stimulus package, even for a normal recession, and like this recession, is that government needs to spend to offset the output gap. What you see in a recession is that companies and workers will start wondering about or become worried about the future path of the economy, and the response to that is to save. So companies start spending less, they'll invest less, and where they can, they'll cut costs. On the side of workers and households, they'll also start saving because they're worried about their future job security. And then basically the economy, because everybody's saving, or because companies and households are saving, it means that only government is able to increase spending. And that's why government has to offset the output gap. There isn't really another option. There isn't a plan B, it has to be government. Next slide. And the second aim is we need to offset the long-term impact of this crisis. This crisis is so large that it's going to have a massive impact on balance sheets of companies and of households. If we look at companies, if their balance sheets get, the quality of their balance sheets gets reduced, if the value of the assets falls, and that will obviously happen because their revenue has fallen, or if debt levels increase, we end up in a situation where companies are insolvent and they won't actually produce to exist in the upswing. And the same for households. When household wealth falls, it means that consumption in the future will decrease. So what we're worried about here is that, given the scale of the crisis, not only are we going to get a recession now, a deep recession now, we could end up with lower growth in the future than we would have had without the crisis. This is called hysteresis. That's the technical term. Next slide, please. So, given this concern that we need to try and fill up the output gap, how large should this package be? There are a number of factors that we need to take into account, and obviously I've simplified it here with the presentation. But the main thing is going to be how deep the recession is. What is the decline in GDP? In South Africa, we saw that the initial forecasts were about 5 to 6% decline. The private sector forecast now are for 10% decline or more than that. So there's definitely been a move towards that the forecast and the projections have taken into account a much bigger decline in GDP. Brian Cantor of Investec did some modeling where he showed that if we take a normal decline in GDP and look into take that into the second quarter of next year, we're going to get an output gap of about R1 trillion, and that's the R1 trillion really that government needs to respond to. And just as for some context, the US nowcasts are looking dire. So the nowcasts are using economic data that's available to try and forecast what's happening in the current quarter. So there are two Reserve Bank offices in America that do that. When Atlanta is forecasting minus 53% for the second quarter, the New York office has a 35% decline in the second quarter. So those are really dire numbers. And I think we'd also have to take into account the fact that US response to the crisis has been much larger and more effective than in South Africa. So if those are the sort of declines they're seeing, I should just caution that that's in the quarter. It's not obviously the annual number. But if that's the sort of number we're seeing, we could be seeing much bigger numbers in South Africa. And I will worry that I think we'd be lucky if we got away with a decline of less than 10%.
Now, that was a discussion held at DTI by TIPS earlier this afternoon. Now, last night, the South African Broadcasting Corporation carried an address by former US President Barack Obama, in which he communicated an understanding of how the different socioeconomic inequalities intertwine in the United States with social norms and racism, and why the current social movement sweeping across the world in opposition to police brutality in the US and elsewhere during this COVID-19 crisis is to be a fundamental in making changes and making significant changes in policies for the future. The COVID-19 crisis shows how more vulnerable socioeconomic groups suffer from a greater risk of financial exposure and also from greater health risks and worse housing conditions during the lockdown period, potentially exacerbating inequalities and fostering anger, protest, agony, and violence.
Our nation and the world is still in the midst of a global pandemic that's exposed the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, but also the disparate treatment and, as a consequence, the disparate impact that exists in our healthcare system, the unequal investment, the biases that have led to a disproportionate number of infections and loss of life in communities of color. So in a lot of ways, what has happened over the last several weeks is challenges and structural problems here in the United States have been thrown into high relief. They're the outcomes not just of the immediate moments in time, but they're the result of a long history of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and institutionalized racism that too often have been the plague, this original sin of our society. And in some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized. Because historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people. Dr. King was a young man when he got involved. Cesar Chavez was a young man. Malcolm X was a young man. The leaders of the feminist movement were young people. Leaders of union movements were young people. The leaders of the environmental movement in this country and the movement to make sure that the LGBT community finally had a voice and was represented were young people. And so when sometimes I feel despair, I just see what's happening with young people all across the country and the talent and the voice and the sophistication that they're displaying. And it makes me feel optimistic. It makes me feel as if, this country's going to get better.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has appointed Professor Wiseman Kuhlu to serve on the African Union's COVID Fund. He joins us now to discuss the economic responses to COVID-19 in Africa and to tell us more about the fund and how it will be designed and whom it will target. Good evening and welcome, Professor. How are you?
Thank you very much, Taneka. Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Good evening. Let's start in America first before we come back to Africa and your task that the President has given you in Africa. Now, there's been an outpouring of grief tonight in America as the first memorial service got underway in Minneapolis for the departed young person who was crushed down in America by police brutality. What do you think that the outpouring of protest and agony means for Black people, poor people, in the light of the COVID-19? You're a community leader.
Yes, Tanika. I spent last night listening.
Professor?
Yes.
Well, hello, are you back? Are you back with us, Professor?
I'm back with you, but I was hearing some other people behind you. Okay, let's start.
Let's proceed. You were saying that you spent last night.
Reacting to that, I spent last night, not because I was really so hurt by the news, by seeing those videos. I spent last night going back, listening to speeches by Marcus Garvey and Martin Luther King, and saying to myself, I thought we had this struggle before, and I thought we had made progress. It's very hurting to say that this generation has also to continue fighting the same struggle for the dignity of the African people. And really, what is happening in America is of great concern to us, because we're all together. This is what Marcus Garvey stood for, and this is what William Du Bois were about. And I couldn't help myself but going back to those leaders of those days, thinking about what they would say if today, in this 21st century, we still fight the struggle that they fought. They thought that they had fought in the last century, and we thought during the 1960s, we had made progress, especially in the US. Very shocking, very disappointing, and it's a great challenge to all of us.
In preparation for the show tonight, I began to look at YouTube videos of African-American and feminist economists this afternoon. And a narrative is rising and a polemic is rising there where they say that where you find large-scale economic and financial inequalities, you will inevitably find racism. What do you think?
Well, racism has been there since the time of slavery, colonialism, and so on. And really, one of the ways in which it manifests itself is economic inequality, is deprivation. And as long as we have these gross inequalities, there is concentration of poverty, especially among blacks, I'm afraid these problems are not going to go away.
Now, back to the African challenges and the response to COVID by many states in Africa. Many of the countries have responded similarly, but many poor countries in Africa felt that they just do not have the fiscal firepower to fight the pandemic. What's the reason behind the AU setting up a fund of the nature which you are involved with?
Yes, the fund that I'm involved with is called the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund. It's going to work, it's going to be complementary to the work that is being done by Trevor Manuel and other envoys. But the focus here is to forge African solidarity. That is, African countries, we must tackle this pandemic jointly, collaboratively. So that's the idea. And that we are mindful of the fact that African countries have got very limited or no fiscal space. But really, one of the tasks of the envoys is to negotiate for debt relief, to give the African countries fiscal space to be able to redirect some of those resources that would otherwise go to debt servicing, be directed towards fighting the COVID-19. And of course, the African countries.
Sorry, Professor, in these tough times for everybody, how are you succeeding with this?
Well, quite a number of African countries actually have made contributions already. We have about 23 million US dollars. South Africa is one of the contributors, and Egypt and a number of other African countries. I think there is appreciation among African countries that there are advantages in working collaboratively and procuring the medical supplies, collaboratively on more favorable terms, and also making sure that we have got mechanisms for ensuring the quality and making the medical requirements available to African countries, on acceptable terms. So there's an appreciation of that. So yeah, there is some money that is coming, and I'm hopeful that from the African wealth, sovereign wealth funds, for instance, and also from African foundations, that is in addition to the governments, the many African countries feel very strong about African solidarity. They are going to go out of their way to make sure that they contribute to the fund.
And how will you disperse the funds?
As the trustees of the Response Fund, we are not going to really have a mechanism ourselves, but we have an arrangement has been made for the Board of Trustees to utilize the services of the Centers for Disease Controls, CDC, as a secretariat. The CDC has got the capabilities to actually determine the needs of what is needed, and also determine what medical supplies are required and where they should be secured. So we have the CDC that is going to fulfill the role of secretariat and be able to come up with strategy. Ours, as the trustees, will be to oversee that process and make sure that there's proper governance over it.
Professor Wiseman Kuhlu, thank you very much for joining us, and Godspeed. Now let's take a short break. Welcome back to Economics Unbound. And on Skype now, we are joined by Professor of Economic Development at WITS, Imran Valodia. Welcome, Imran. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Imran, we are looking at a rash of protests and COVID-related protests, whether they're about food or about racial prejudice, or whether they're about access to healthcare. What does it say about the way in which the virus has laid bare all the social weaknesses?
Well, I think what it is exposing is the tremendous amount of inequality within the economic system, and I think we're seeing kind of with the pandemic, we're seeing large amounts of that inequality being exposed. So for many, the kind of impact of something like the lockdown is simply that you can you kind of have to spend time in your house and can do your work from home. But I think for many others, what the pandemic is about really is kind of exposing the fact that large numbers of us sort of can't earn any income at all. And I think in the US, you're seeing the kind of tremendous inequality in the way that the pandemic's playing out from health, kind of from a health perspective as well.
Why is racialized inequality like we have in the US and in our country so persistent? What kind of future policy matrix can we design as a society that will make sure that we emerge a more equal and a more egalitarian society in line with the promise of our Constitution?
Look, I think there's two possible kind of outcomes of what's likely to happen after we come through the pandemic. The one is that things are going to be a lot harder, and I think inequality could actually get much worse. But I think the hope is that in many instances in our history, it's major kind of events of this sort that kind of really expose the inequalities and the poverty in our system, and I think events like the one that we're living through kind of provide the impetus for a new type of an economic system and for major structural changes in the way that the economy operates. So I think some of the things that we would have to do would be to firstly have a growth pattern that kind of really includes a lot more in the kind of benefits of that growth. I think we're going to require a kind of different type of infrastructure system, and I think what the health kind of epidemics exposing is the tremendous inequalities in public services, which are provided by both the public sector and the private sector, and the need to restructure those systems, I think, is quite an important part of what we're learning.
But isn't it true that if we put more firepower into this hole, the contraction, shouldn't a fiscal stimulus package be the size of the anticipated contraction so that you pack in some resilience and so that the bottom is not, we don't stay in the dip and that we rise from this with as little permanent scarring as possible? What would you say if I were to say that to you?
Yeah, so I think what I take from the experience that we're having here is that kind of our problem in South Africa kind of seems to be less with the quantity of the stimulus package, and much more to do with the inability of the state.
You mean that the capacity of the state to manage the pandemic is hampering the recovery efforts and will hamper any policy and package of the future?
Well, that and the kind of inability to kind of deal with some of the economic dimensions. So I'll kind of give you two examples. I mean, we have so as part of the 500 billion package, there's a package that's kind of provided through the UIF system to support firms that are unable to pay their workers. The kind of evidence is that scheme is not operating as effectively as it should because of the bureaucracy kind of inside the system and the kind of inability of the institution to manage it. Another example would be the kind of 350 rand grant that's been provided for those who are unemployed. I mean, the data on the numbers that have actually received that grant, and we're now almost 70 days into into a lockdown, is kind of really appalling. I think the department is not managing to pay that grant as fast as it should. So for me, it's less about the quantum of the stimulus package as the fact that our institutions are not really geared up enough to kind of deliver on the package.
Well, that's a great tragedy. Thank you very much, Professor Valodia. The COVID-19 crisis has laid bare the myriad of social and economic inequities in societies, ranging from our own to societies abroad, and the sweep of protests across the globe magnifies this. A brand of people's economics is emerging, with leading economists and academics and policymakers committing themselves to breaking the stranglehold that elites have over the discipline of economics itself. This edition of Economics Unbound talks to some of the leading economists and policymakers in the space. Now, we have been chatting to Ha-Jun Chang of the School of Economics at Cambridge University. And he is one of such global thought leaders in economics. We at the economics desk at the SABC have been interacting with him this week. We will bring you a full interview with Ha-Jun Chang next week. But now, courtesy of the Institute of New Economic Thinking, here is what he thinks about rescuing economics from elites.
Hi, I'm Ha-Jun Chang. I have been teaching economics at the University of Cambridge. Education about the general public, what I call mass economic literacy, is extremely important because we cannot make our society better without changing the economy. Somehow, we have come to get our priority wrong. Finance or the economy, they are means to an end. The end should be human welfare, society that takes care of the weak, and finance or production or all these things should be considered as a means. Somehow we have inverted the means and the ends. You have to accept that a lot of people who discuss these things come from a background where they probably have never met a person who's ever been unemployed in their lives. They've never met a poor person. They've never lived in deprived areas. So for them, I mean, these are like unicorns, something that exists in stories. This is why I believe that mass economic literacy is so important. Ordinary citizens need to know what's going on. They need to understand the basic principles of economics and what is wrong with the version that they are getting. Only then they can speak for themselves. Unfortunately, economists have been fantastically good at making people believe that what they do is very difficult. People have very strong opinions on all sorts of things. The European Union, climate change, the Iraq War. I have my views on the Iraq War, but do I have a degree in international relations? I mean, I took one international relations class back in 1983, but I still make comments. I still have strong views. But when it comes to economics, a lot of people say, oh, that's for the experts. Too complicated for me. No, it's only because people have been scared into believing that this is too difficult. You just listen to us. The Brexit example is a perfect example of that kind of approach backfiring, because now people say, well, we don't know what you are saying, but we think you are wrong. If we had paid more attention to making people understand about the economy and have more informed opinion about it, they might have a rather different approach to the whole thing. Today, economics has become the language of power. In the old days, the Vatican banned the translation of the Bible from Latin into local vernacular languages. So only educated priests and some elites that could read it. So you have to change this way that people understand about taxation, government spending, social insurance. I mean, this idea that poor people are just taking, no, poor people also pay taxes. Economists use this term tax burden. It's price that you pay for public service. Do you call your Netflix subscription a burden because it's taking money away from you? But that's not how people see it. We all have to play a role. Ultimately, it's the people. Are we going to argue for some kind of dictatorship? I lived the first 25 years of my life under military dictatorship, and I don't recommend it to anyone. Ordinary citizens have to engage in this, because that's the price you have to pay to have democracy.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Goodbye and good night.